I'm, I'm going to begin today with a few stories that talk to the beginning of Earth Day. And first, I want to offer an excerpt from a significant speech in 1970. It started this way. The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of this country. It is a cause of particular concern to young Americans because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are needed now if we are to prevent disaster later. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. If we act now, they can be. Those words, delivered in January of 1970, had been influenced by a 1969 that saw 400 square miles of California's coast affected by a 100,000 barrel oil spill from an offshore drilling rig. And the oil spill that lit the Cuyahoga River in Ohio on fire in June of 1969 was actually the 13th time the Cuyahoga had been engulfed in flame between 1868 and 1969. But those two events, the California spill and the Cuyahoga on fire, are the dramatic mile markers of environmental degradation in the United States. According to a Time magazine article in 1963, smog killed 400 New Yorkers, and Lake Erie's oxygen content had become so depleted that the center of the lake sustained precious little life. Scientists announced that in addition to those New York statistics, auto exhaust was at high enough levels in some places that it could cause birth defects. A 1969 report by the Government Accountability Office found that of the 80 industrial plants with state permits to discharge waste within a 170-mile reach of the Mississippi River, 28 of those plants disclosed no information at all about the amount or the nature of the waste they were discharging. Pollution had gotten bad enough to be undeniable, and science had become advanced enough to make the reasons why clear. It was no wonder that President Richard Nixon, in his January State of the Union speech, would recognize, as you heard earlier, the great question of the 70s is, shall we begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? It was in this context of environmental disaster that on April 22nd, 1970, the first Earth Day was organized and held. Gaylord Nelson, a US Senator from Wisconsin, helped start that first Earth Day because he wanted to take one day out of the year and dedicate it toward public recognition and respect of the environment. Nelson said, and this is an oft-quoted Earth Day kickoff speech from Nelson, "Our goal is not just an environment of clean air and clean and water and scenic beauty. The objective is an environment of decency, quality, and mutual respect for all other human beings and all other living creatures." Earth Day did focus the public on our environment, and that focus helped generate a notable list of legislative responses. In December of 1970, Congress ratified the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. It followed up in 1972 with the passage of the Clean Water Act. And then in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which governs the disposal of hazardous and non-hazardous waste. And then in that same year, in 76, the Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates the introduction of new or already existing chemicals. And then in 1980, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which most of us know as the Superfund Law, was passed and investigations and cleanups began at sites contaminated by hazardous substances. So the power of focusing public opinion on challenges facing our environment, the goal of Earth Day, was actually made never more clear than in 1972 when Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and President Nixon, the same guy who 2 years earlier said, "We still think of air as free, but clean air is not free. Neither is clean water. The price tag on pollution control is high. Through our years of past carelessness, we incurred a debt to nature, and now that debt is being called." But Nixon in 72, after Congress passed the Clean Water Act, vetoed the act against the recommendation of his own appointed first EPA administrator. He was in favor, he said, of finding a less expensive way to accomplish the restoration and continued protection of our nation's water. It took the Senate less than 2 hours in a bipartisan vote to overturn his veto. And that same day, the House followed that, overturning the veto with a vote of 247 to 23, with 96 of those yes votes in the House coming from Republicans. I took the time to share that story because I thought it might be nice to know that in the 1970s, the powers of compelling scientific evidence, coupled with the popular movement epitomized by over 20 million people across the United States participating in that first Earth Day's rallies and marches, I thought it might be nice to remember that those two functions, those two activities, resulted in bipartisan support for legitimate legislative advances. As Earth Day celebrations entered their second decade, the 80s, we embarked on what the New York Times journalist Nathaniel Rich has called the decade we almost stopped climate change. Rich writes in his article and later book, nearly everything we understand about global warming was understood in 1979. He chronicles the attempts at getting solid science delivered to policymakers and to the public. He identifies global cooperation during the 80s that culminated in November of 1989 at the Noordwijk Climate Conference in the Netherlands, where 68 countries came together. The vast majority came ready to sign an international treaty calling for a freeze on carbon emissions. It is unfortunately true that the United States led the disruption of the conference's goal, and they did not sign that agreement. And Rich says, we've never gotten that close to meaningful international agreement on carbon emissions ever since. In those 30 years plus since 1989, Earth Day celebrations have been annual linchpins for drawing people's focus to living more responsibly and caring for our environment. Our environmental consciousness has grown in the past 50 years, and with a few notable periods of time that were exceptions, our enforcement of environmental standards and guidelines has also moved forward. Air quality is notably improved in a majority of major American cities. Lake Erie and the Cuyahoga River are still under repair, but they are undeniably healthier and they are not on fire. And one report stated that the lead pollution along the Mississippi could almost be described as non-existent since the implementation of the Clean Water Act's runoff restrictions. One report said lead levels are 1,000 times lower than they were in 1979. Earth Day has been a part of lifting our collective environmental consciousness, and I really do endorse the continued celebration of Earth Day. I want us to find those examples in our daily lives that can improve how we impact our environment. With the consistency of our annual Earth Day celebrations, so has our Green Sanctuary Committee at KUUF, in alliance with other community groups, been consistently pushing for the expansion of local recycling opportunities. And I know members of KUUF have been involved in organizations leading the ongoing fight to clean up the waste exhaust from the Warden power plant in Lance. Carol Ekstrom, our Green Sanctuary Committee chairperson, wrote to me about her sense of Earth Day, and she said, "I want people to do something to show they care for the Earth. There are simple, doable actions people could take to show they care. Gardening, planting a tree, reflecting on a hike, learning more about soil, creating new soil, preventing stuff from going to the landfill. Everyone can do something to address climate change." Carol finished by saying, "Today it is even more important than it was 51 years ago when Earth Day was established." I agree. And I should probably stop right there. But I admit, I am uneasy. In Nathaniel Rich's article, I found this statement that helped me sort of figure out maybe a way to state why I'm uneasy. And Rich wrote, "The distant perils of climate change are no longer very distant. Many have already begun to occur. We are capable of good works, altruism, and wisdom, and a growing number of people have devoted their lives to helping civilization avoid the worst. We have a solution in hand: carbon taxes, increased investment in renewable and nuclear energy, and decarbonization technology," Rich continued. "From a technology and economic standpoint, it is still readily possible to stay under 2 degrees centigrade." By the way, 2 degrees Celsius, is what a reference to the increase in global temperature that Rich said will definitely result in unavoidable long-term consequences. But if we keep it at 2 degrees, we might avoid short-term disaster. Rich continued, "We can trust the technology and the economics. It's harder to trust human nature. Keeping the planet to 2 degrees of warming would require transformative action. It will take more than good works and voluntary commitments. It will take a revolution. But in order to become a revolutionary, you need first to suffer," he said. When I read that piece from Rich's article, I was immediately reminded of a Sunday service from nearly 2 Earth Days ago. We talked about Joanna Macy's thought of a great turning. You might remember Macy calling on us to recognize when it comes to climate change, the business as usual approach isn't sustainable. And the next moment in the climate change epic is that what she called the great unraveling. It includes her recognition that economic growth depends on an ever-increasing input of resources and generates ever higher levels of toxic waste. Deepening economic inequalities are then stressing the ability of communities and nations to hold together. And as trust levels fall, we find ourselves battling enemies for control of resources and dissipate our collective energy to address the threats presented by deepening inequalities, resource depletion, and climate change. The more we push beyond sustainable limits, Macy said, the more the unraveling occurs. Macy's unraveling feels very similar to me to Rich's sense of suffering. And Macy's final offering, that of the great turning, she describes it as a shift in consciousness, a new way of not just living, but of thinking and feeling. Macy's new way of thinking, living, and feeling sounds very similar to Rich calling for a revolution. And I know if this feels too theoretical, I'll try to offer one example. There's a gazillion examples, but I think we are all familiar with the fights against fossil fuel conveyance pipelines across the country and across the world. Maybe the most notable one was the Standing Rock Indian Reservation fight of a few years ago. That reservation straddles North and South Dakota border, and it is the site of a significant stand against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Representatives from hundreds of tribes, along with their allies, protested in the courts and on the ground to stop potential environmental damage a pipeline spill would cause, and they demanded an end to the desecration of sacred sites during the construction process. That's typically what we heard as the reasons for the protests, but clearly it was more than that. And it is more than that at Line 3 in Minnesota, and at Line 5 at the Sioux, and at the LNG terminal, refinery in Tacoma, and the list would go on and on. The challenges, each of these are challenges to business as usual. What is also being stated at all of these challenges is that the unraveling has gone on too long and we are suffering. We need to stop our dependence on fossil fuels and truly embrace a new way of living, thinking, and feeling. These challenges to pipelines conveying fossil fuel elements are nothing short of a revolution. After all this talking, I won't tell you that I know the best next step in this revolution, but I know that if we don't agitate ourselves to a new way of living, thinking, and feeling, if we don't take revolutionary acts, we will face short-term disaster and a revolution will be imposed on us. I'm going to leave this talk still uneasy because I recognize the past and current benefit of celebrating Earth Day, the legislative advances of the 70s and continued growth of our collective environmental consciousness. I want to be part of the real good work each of us can do to celebrate Earth Day. What I can't get away from is that it's also a day to share a call for revolution. I'll leave you with this thought. Inspired by an internal memo from the private security firm hired by Dakota Access Pipeline owners. In reference to the protesters at Standing Rock, the memo called the pipeline opposition movement, quote, an ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component. When I read that line, I thought, it sounds like that description could or should fit Unitarian Universalists. So on this Earth Day, I invite you to join me in working with our KUUF community garden and supporting our Grow an Extra Row project. Join me in being part of next Saturday's Earth Week walk. It's in the digest. Or today at noon, you can be part of a community fruit tree planting. And Linda Belote's going to put her email address in the chat right now. She's a contact so for you to follow up with that activity for Earth Week here. Or also another contact, and I hope he'll put his email in the chat as well, is Horst, to talk about an Earth Day meeting on Thursday the 22nd, a public hearing that is going to be talking about making Michigan carbon neutral by 2050. They're asking for public input. And there's a whole other list of Earth Week opportunities that are in our latest digest. And I invite us all to be active and take part in those things. But also, let's start planning our ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component. It's Earth Day, and it's time. Thank you.